The day I found out my sister had sold every piece of our grandmother's jewelry, I was standing in an empty drawer that still smelled like lavender and decades of quiet love. The drawer was in the back bedroom of Grandma Nettie's house, the small cedar one with the brass pull that stuck a little unless you knew to lift and tug at the same time. I had known how to open that drawer since I was 7 years old. Every Sunday after church, Grandma Nettie would let me sit on the edge of her bed and watch her choose which piece to wear. She had a way of holding each one up to the light first, turning it slowly, like she was saying hello to an old friend before deciding whether to bring them along for the day. A pearl strand her mother had worn to her own wedding. A gold locket the size of a thumbnail with a photograph inside so small you needed to squint to see the faces. A garnet bracelet she called her Tuesday piece because she said garnets were too serious for weekends. An emerald ring with a slightly bent prong that she'd been meaning to fix for 30 years and never did because she said imperfect things were the ones with the best stories. I knew every single piece. I could have listed them in the dark. The drawer was empty. Not reorganized, not moved to a different room, not tucked into a velvet travel case for safekeeping. Empty in the way a place only looks when someone has made a deliberate decision to clear it out. The cedar lining was pale and bare, and the only thing left was a faint impression in the wood where the pearl strand had rested so consistently for so many years that the surface had molded itself to the shape of the clasp. I stood there for a long time. My name is Cecilia, and the story I'm about to tell you is about what happens when a family decides that one daughter is the keeper and the other is the owner, and nobody ever bothers to explain the difference until everything worth keeping is already gone. Let me tell you who Grandma Nettie was, because you can't understand what was taken without understanding what she meant. Her full name was Antoinette, but nobody had called her that since the Eisenhower administration. She was the daughter of a seamstress and a railroad man, raised in a house with 4 children and 1 bathroom, and a mother who believed that beautiful things were not luxuries, but necessities. Her mother had taught her that a woman should own at least 3 things that were entirely hers, things that couldn't be repossessed or borrowed or divided in a divorce, things that held their value even when everything else crumbled. So Nettie had spent her life collecting carefully and deliberately, not extravagantly. She was never an extravagant woman. She'd worn the same winter coat for 11 years and thought people who bought new cars every 3 years were showing off to nobody in particular. But jewelry was different. Jewelry, she said, was history you could hold. Every piece she owned had a story attached to it, and she had made sure I knew every single one. The pearl strand came from her mother. Worn on her mother's wedding day in 1941, kept in a handkerchief pouch through 4 relocations and 1 house fire. The pearls had survived because her mother had been wearing them when the fire started and had walked out the door with them still around her neck, which Grandma Nettie always said proved that beautiful things attach themselves to the people who love them. The gold locket had been a gift from my grandfather on their first anniversary. The photograph inside was the 2 of them, barely 20, standing in front of a car he'd borrowed for the occasion. He'd given it to her with a card that read, "So you never have to go anywhere without me." He'd been dead for 18 years, and she still wore the locket on his birthday every single year. The garnet bracelet she had bought herself. That was the piece she was most proud of, she once told me, because it was the only one she hadn't received from someone else. She'd saved up for 6 months from the money she made selling her baked goods at the church fair, gone into the jewelry store alone on a Tuesday afternoon, and bought it with exact change. "A woman should buy herself something beautiful at least once," she said, "so she knows she doesn't have to wait for someone else to decide she deserves it." The emerald ring with the bent prong had belonged to a woman named Dorothea, a neighbor who had lived next door to my grandmother for 22 years and had no children and no family to speak of. When Dorothea died, she left the ring to Nettie in a handwritten will that the lawyer said barely qualified legally, but managed to hold up anyway. Nettie had worn it on her right hand ever since, and when people asked about it, she told them about Dorothea, the way she kept her garden, the way she made strong coffee at 4 in the afternoon and invited you in whether you had time or not. The ring was a eulogy she wore on her finger. There were 11 pieces in total. I could describe every single one from memory because Nettie had described them to me so many times, in so many Sunday morning rituals that they had become part of my own memory, part of my own history, even though none of them technically belonged to me. And that distinction, what technically belongs to whom, is where this entire story lives. My sister's name is Renata. She is 3 years younger than me, louder by approximately 300%, and has always moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who has never once been told her instincts were wrong. Growing up, Renata was the one who charmed every room, and I was the one who remembered where everyone left their keys. She got the laughs. I got the trust. She got the spotlight. I got the quiet responsibility of being the one people relied on when the spotlight went dark. I don't say this with bitterness. It is simply the architecture of how we were built, and for most of our lives, the structure held. Renata loved Grandma Nettie. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because nothing about what I'm going to tell you changes the fact that she loved her. She just loved her differently than I did. Renata loved Nettie the way you love a wonderful restaurant, with warmth and nostalgia and genuine pleasure every time you visit, but without the constant low hum of responsibility that comes with knowing where the kitchen is and how long it takes to clean up after closing. I was the one who drove Nettie to her cardiology appointments. I was the one who figured out the new pill organizer when the pharmacy changed her prescription bottles and she got confused. I was the one who sat with her for 4 hours during a thunderstorm in March when she was 81 and the power went out and she didn't want to say out loud that she was frightened, but her hands were shaking. I made tea on the gas stove and we played gin rummy by candlelight, and at one point she looked at me over her cards and said, "Cecilia, you're the one who shows up." I didn't think of it as a special quality. I thought of it as just being a person. You show up. That's the basic requirement. But it turned out that showing up quietly and consistently, over many years, without fanfare or acknowledgement, creates an impression that is invisible until it's suddenly load-bearing. Nettie passed on a Sunday. Of course she did. She was a Sunday person in every way. She had her first stroke on a Thursday, spent 3 days in a hospital room that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and quiet efficiency, and then slipped away on a Sunday morning while the sun was coming through the east-facing window in exactly the way it used to come through her bedroom window on the mornings. She'd let me sit and watch her choose her jewelry. I was with her. Renata was 3 states away at a bachelorette weekend for a college friend. She got there by Sunday evening, and by then it was too late, and neither of us said anything about the timing because grief doesn't sort itself by who deserved to be there. What happened next is what the grief counselor would probably call the administrative phase. There was a will. The will was straightforward in the way only very clear-headed women's wills tend to be. The house went to my parents to manage and eventually sell, with the proceeds split equally between our family and a church fund Nettie had been contributing to for 40 years. Personal belongings were to be divided between her 2 granddaughters. That was Renata and me, with a note that read, "I trust them to do it kindly." That sentence, "I trust them to do it kindly." I have thought about that sentence every single day for 8 months. The division of Nettie's belongings was supposed to happen in an organized way. My mother suggested we wait 6 weeks, let the sharpest edges of grief dull a little, and then go through the house together. The 4 of us, my parents, Renata, and me, making decisions room by room with patience and fairness. That plan lasted approximately 4 days. On the 5th day after Nettie's passing, Renata called my mother and said she was going to swing by the house to pick up a few sentimental things before heading back to her own city. My mother, still soft and raw with grief, said, "Of course, take what you need. The house isn't going anywhere." My father said nothing because he was in the particular silence that overcomes men of a certain generation when the women around them are hurting and he didn't know how to navigate it. Nobody called me. I found out 3 weeks later, almost by accident. I was at the house to help my mother sort through some paperwork, insurance documents, utility accounts, the specific bureaucracy of death that nobody prepares you for, and I went to the back bedroom to get a pen from the side table, and instead I opened the cedar drawer by reflex, the way you reach for something you've always known is there. And it wasn't. Nothing was. I stood very still the way you do when something impossible is staring at you from an empty space. I checked the side table drawer, the vanity, the top of the dresser, the velvet box on the closet shelf where Nettie kept pieces she was setting aside for repairs. I checked every corner of that room with the specific focus of a person whose brain hasn't yet agreed with what her eyes are telling her. Then I went and asked my mother where Nettie's jewelry was. My mother's face did something complicated. She set down the insurance folder she was holding. She said, slowly and carefully, that Renata had taken some things when she came by. Some things, I said. My mother wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I asked her what specifically Renata had taken. My mother said she hadn't watched closely. She'd been in the kitchen. She'd heard Renata moving around. She'd assumed Renata was just collecting a few pieces to remember Nettie by. I asked her if she'd seen any of the jewelry since then. She hadn't. I asked if she'd thought to ask Renata about it. She hadn't. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I was very calm in the specific way I get when something large and terrible is assembling itself in my peripheral vision, and I haven't yet decided whether to look at it directly. Then I called Renata. Renata answered on the second ring, which meant she wasn't expecting trouble. People who are expecting trouble let it go to voicemail first so they have time to prepare. Hey, she said, bright and easy. What's up? I asked her how she was. I asked about her drive back. I asked a few warm-up questions because I am, fundamentally, a person who cannot begin a confrontation without first making sure the other person knows the conversation began in good faith. My therapist has called this a strength and a vulnerability at the same time. She's right on both counts. Then I asked about the jewelry. A beat of silence. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds is a very long time in a conversation with Renata, who fills silence the way water fills a container, automatically, completely, and without apparent effort. I just took a few pieces to remember her by, she said. Her voice had changed slightly. The easiness had a frame around it now. I asked which pieces. She listed 2. The garnet bracelet and a small gold chain I remembered as one of the less significant pieces in the collection. Something Nettie had bought on a trip to a craft fair and worn occasionally, but without the deep history of the others. I asked about the pearls. Silence. I asked about the locket. Longer silence. I asked about the emerald ring. And here is where the conversation became something I will remember with perfect clarity for the rest of my life. Because Renata didn't lie to me. I want to give her that. She didn't construct an elaborate story or try to redirect me. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual but had a tremor underneath it. I needed some money, see. I asked her what she meant. She said she'd sold some of the pieces. I asked which pieces. She said most of them. I asked where. She said there was an estate jewelry buyer on the main street in the town near Nettie's house. She'd gone there on the way out. I asked when. She said the day she came to pick things up. The day of. She had sold our grandmother's jewelry the same afternoon she collected it from the drawer, before the body had been in the ground for 2 full weeks. She had walked into a stranger's shop with the pearl strand her great-grandmother had worn out of a burning house and handed it across a glass counter for cash. I asked her how much she'd gotten. She said she didn't want to say. I said I think you should. She told me. The number was somewhere between an insult and a devastation. Estate jewelry buyers are not in the business of paying what things are worth. They are in the business of paying what they can get away with paying, which in this case was a fraction of the actual value of the collection and approximately nothing compared to what those pieces meant. I told her I needed to think, and I ended the call. Here is the thing that nobody tells you about moments like this one. The anger doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, like sediment, each one settling before the next one falls. The first layer was the simple factual grief of the objects themselves. Those pieces were gone. Whatever Renata had been paid, those specific things, the particular warmth of that locket, the slight heaviness of the garnet bracelet, the bent prong on the emerald ring that had never been fixed, were in the display case of a stranger's shop or already sold onward to someone who would never know Dorothea's name. The second layer was the understanding of what had been decided without me. Renata had looked at a drawer full of things that belonged to both of us by every reasonable measure of love and history and relationship, and she had made a unilateral decision to take them all and convert them to cash and tell no one. She hadn't asked. She hadn't offered to split anything. She hadn't paused to consider that I might want the locket, or the pearls, or even the bent emerald ring with its story about the neighbor who made coffee at 4 in the afternoon. The third layer, and this one took the longest to settle, was the recognition that this was not an isolated event. It was the most recent and most dramatic installment of a pattern I had been tolerating for years. Renata who borrowed and didn't return. Renata who needed and received and considered the transaction complete without ever balancing the ledger. Renata who had grown up understanding, at some cellular level, that I would absorb whatever overflow came from her direction and file it under love, and that love, in our family's accounting, did not require receipts. Except I had receipts. That was the part she didn't know. I need to explain the receipts. 3 years before Nettie passed, when her memory had begun to soften at the edges and her cardiologist had started using the phrase, "We should talk about the future," Nettie had asked me to help her organize her affairs. Not the legal ones, she had a lawyer for that, a small firm in town she'd trusted for 20 years. But the personal ones, the inventory of what she had and where it was and what she wanted done with it. We spent 3 Sundays doing this together. She sat in her chair by the window, and I sat across from her with a legal pad, and she went through every room, every drawer, every box on every shelf, and told me what each item was and what she wanted to happen to it and why it mattered. She was very precise. Nettie had always been precise. She was the kind of woman who kept every card anyone had ever sent her organized by year in a shoebox and could find any specific one within 2 minutes. The jewelry, she was especially precise about. She described each piece. Its origin, its history, its approximate value based on what she'd paid or what she'd been told when pieces were appraised. She told me which pieces had sentimental value that outweighed monetary value and which pieces she considered interchangeable. She told me that the pearl strand, the locket, the garnet bracelet, and the emerald ring were the 4 she considered her most important, and that she hoped they would stay in the family. She said the word hoped very deliberately. She was a clear-eyed woman. She knew that hopes and legal documents were different things, and that once she was gone, the hope part was in the hands of the people she'd left behind. I wrote everything down. At the end of each Sunday session, I typed my handwritten notes into a document and printed them out and brought them back the following Sunday for her to review and correct. She made small adjustments. Added details I'd missed. Initialed each page at the bottom right corner with her signature N in the distinctive looping way she'd written it her whole life. When we were finished, I had a 23-page document covering every meaningful item she owned. I had photographs I'd taken of each piece of jewelry with my phone, organized in a folder. I had a list of the appraisal values she'd been given when she'd had several pieces assessed 5 years earlier for insurance purposes, with the insurance agent's name and company attached. I did this because I am the kind of person who does this, not because I suspected anything, not because I was protecting myself against a future I couldn't see. I did it because Nettie asked me to, and because organizing things so they don't fall through the cracks is simply how I move through the world. I am the person who knows where the keys are. I kept the document in a folder on my computer labeled Nettie's things, and I didn't think about it again for 3 years. Until I was standing at an empty cedar drawer that smelled like lavender and realized that having the receipts was about to matter more than I had ever expected. I did not call Renata back that night. I did not call my parents. I did not do anything dramatic or reactive because I have learned, through a life of being the absorber, that the most powerful position you can occupy in a situation like this is the still one. The one where you have all the information you need and you decide, very deliberately, what to do with it. What I did that night was open my computer and find the folder labeled Nettie's Things. I went through the document. I cross-referenced the list against what Renata had told me she'd taken. I pulled up the photographs of each piece on my phone and went through them one by one, matching them against the descriptions in the document with Nettie's initials at the bottom of every page. Then I called the estate jewelry shop. I want to tell you that this felt dramatic, but it didn't. It felt like the most logical next step in the world. If something has been taken from a place and you know approximately where it went, you go there and ask about it. That's not drama. That's just following a thing to its location. The shop was called Meridian Estate Jewelers. I found them easily online. Their website had a cheerful banner that said, "We buy gold, silver, and precious stones, fair prices, immediate payment." I called their main number, and a man named Douglas answered with a slightly rushed professionalism that suggested he was also doing something else at the same time. I told him my name. I told him my grandmother had passed recently and that I was helping to settle her estate. I told him I was trying to account for some pieces of jewelry I believed had been brought to his shop approximately 3 weeks prior. I described the pearl strand. I described the locket. I described the garnet bracelet. I described the emerald ring with the bent prong. There was a pause on Douglas's end that told me he remembered them. He said that estate purchases were a private transaction, and he wasn't able to discuss the details of what came through the shop without documentation of estate authority. I said I understood completely and asked if it would be helpful if I provided documentation showing these items were listed as part of my grandmother's estate inventory, including photographs and appraisal records. Longer pause. He said yes, that would be helpful. I said I'd email them within the hour. I sent him 16 pages of the document, including the photographs, including the insurance appraisal records, including the page with the 4 most important pieces described in detail with Nettie's initials at the bottom right corner. He called me back the next morning. Douglas was, as it turned out, a careful man. He had been in the estate jewelry business for 22 years. He had encountered, over the course of those 22 years, situations where items brought in for sale had provenance questions attached to them. He had a system for this. He held certain items for 30 days before reselling them, particularly high-value pieces, particularly pieces where the seller was young and seemed rushed and hadn't had the documentation that typically accompanied estate items. He had held 3 of the 4 pieces: the pearl strand, the locket, the emerald ring. He had put them in a separate case marked pending review because something about the transaction had felt unresolved to him, and he'd learned over 22 years to trust that feeling. The garnet bracelet had already been sold. I sat with that information quietly for a moment. The piece Nettie had been most proud of, the one she had bought for herself with 6 months of church fare money, exact change, on a Tuesday afternoon, that one was gone. And I felt the loss of it in a specific, acute way that I hadn't felt even when I'd first found the empty drawer. Because somehow the garnet bracelet being gone felt like the part of the story where an irreversible thing had already happened, and you just have to decide what to do about the parts that are still recoverable. I asked Douglas what would need to happen to recover the remaining 3 pieces. He explained the process carefully. Because the items were part of a documented estate, and because the person who had sold them had not presented estate documentation or proof of authority to dispose of estate assets, and because Douglas was a careful man who had seen this before, there was a path. It was not a simple path. It involved paperwork and possibly legal counsel, and a conversation I was not looking forward to having. But it was a path. I thanked Douglas. I asked him to hold the 3 pieces pending resolution. He said he would. Then I hung up and started making a list, because making a list is how I begin every problem that is large enough to require more than one step. The conversation with my parents was the hardest one, and I want to tell you about it in detail because I think it matters. I drove to their house on a Saturday morning. I brought coffee because bringing coffee to a difficult conversation is the logistical equivalent of saying I am not here to fight, I am here to talk, and both of those things can be true at the same time. My mother opened the door and knew immediately from the particular quality of my stillness that something significant was happening. She is a perceptive woman. She has always been perceptive. She just sometimes chooses, in the way that certain people do, to apply her perception selectively. We sat at the kitchen table. I put the folder on the table, the printed version, 23 pages, Nettie's initials. I told them everything in order, because order is the best defense against the kind of emotional flooding that makes people stop listening. I told them about the empty drawer. I told them about the call with Renata. I told them about Douglas and Meridian Estate Jewelers. I told them about the 3 pieces in holding and the garnet bracelet that was already gone. My father's face went through several stages, like a forecast passing through. Disbelief, then recognition, then something that looked like a man realizing he should have asked more questions 3 weeks ago and hadn't. My mother started to cry, which I had expected, and I let her do it for a moment before I continued, because she wasn't crying performatively. She was crying the way people cry when they understand that something they chose to look away from has grown into something they now have to look at directly. I showed them the document. I showed them the photographs. I showed them the page with the appraisal values, and then I showed them the number Renata had been paid for a collection conservatively worth 4 to 6 times that amount. Not because the money was the point. It wasn't the point. But because the specific gap between what things were worth and what they had been traded for in a rushed transaction 3 weeks after their owner's death told a story about what kind of decision Renata had made. And I needed my parents to hold that specific information and not let the emotional weight of the situation blur it into something softer than it actually was. My mother looked at the number for a long time. Then she said very quietly, she needed it. And that was the moment I understood what I was actually dealing with. Not a single bad decision made in the fog of grief. A pattern that my parents had been participating in for years by accepting Renata's needs as sufficient explanation for anything she'd done to meet them. I said I understood that Renata had needed money. I said I also understood that needing something is not the same as having the right to take it. I said that there were 11 pieces of jewelry in that drawer, and our grandmother had left them to both of us. And Renata had taken 9 and sold 8 without asking me, without asking our parents, without asking anyone. I said the question of what Renata needed was separate from the question of what Renata had taken. The table was very quiet for a while. My father put his hand on my mother's hand. He looked at me. He said, "What do you need from us?" It was such a simple question, and it was the right one, and I wasn't fully prepared for how much it mattered to hear it, so I took a breath before I answered. I said I needed them to support recovering the 3 pieces Douglas was holding. I said I needed them to have a direct conversation with Renata about what had happened. I said I was not interested in legal action against my own sister, but that I needed the people in this family to agree, out loud, that what had been done was wrong, and that the explanation of need didn't make it right. My mother nodded, my father nodded. And then my father said something that surprised me. He said, "Your grandmother told me once that Cecilia is the one who sees things clearly. I thought she just meant at work." The conversation with Renata happened 4 days later. My parents arranged it, which I had asked them to do because I felt strongly that it needed to be a family conversation and not just the 2 of us, because when it was just the 2 of us, the dynamic defaulted too easily to its old shape, me absorbing, her explaining, both of us ending up back where we started. We sat in my parents' living room. Renata drove 3 hours to be there, which told me she understood the seriousness of it in a way she hadn't been willing to say on the phone. She looked tired. She had the specific look of someone who has been carrying a thing they can't put down because there's nowhere to put it. I had the folder on the coffee table. I hadn't opened it yet. Renata looked at it and then at me, and the first thing she said was, "I know what's in there." I said I knew she did. She said she was sorry. She said it simply and directly, which was not the Renata I'd been braced for. I'd been braced for the explaining Renata, the reframing Renata, the Renata who could make a wrong thing sound like a series of unfortunate circumstances that nobody could really be blamed for. Instead, I got a quiet woman sitting on my parents' couch who looked like she'd been having a very long conversation with herself and hadn't liked most of what she'd heard. She told us about the debt. She hadn't talked about it to anyone. A combination of credit card balances and a personal loan from 2 years ago when a business idea she'd invested in had failed cleanly and totally. She'd been managing it month to month for almost 2 years, paying enough to keep it from being catastrophic, but not enough to actually reduce it, and the weight of it had become the background noise of her daily life. When Nettie died and Renata stood in that bedroom and saw the drawer full of jewelry, something had happened in her brain that she described as a calculation she didn't make consciously, more like a switch being thrown. She had stood there and seen a solution, and she had taken it before she allowed herself to think carefully about what she was taking. I let her finish, then I opened the folder. I didn't make a speech. I just turned pages and let her look at what was in them. The list, the photographs, the appraisal values. The page with Nettie's initials, looping and clear, next to descriptions of the pearl strand and the locket and the garnet bracelet and the emerald ring. I watched Renata's face as she read Nettie's own words about each piece, because I had included in the document the stories. The way Nettie had told them to me on those 3 Sundays, the fire her mother walked out of wearing the pearls, the anniversary card from our grandfather, the 6 months of church fair savings counted out in exact change. Renata put her hand over her mouth when she got to the garnet bracelet. She didn't cry loudly. She cried quietly, the way people cry when they're not asking for sympathy, just experiencing something that has arrived at full weight. I told her that Douglas at Meridian Estate Jewelers had 3 pieces in holding: the pearls, the locket, and the emerald ring. That recovering them would require documentation and potentially some negotiation with Douglas about the terms, but that it was possible. That I had already begun that process. That the garnet bracelet was gone. She looked at me and said, I didn't know about the garnet, what it meant. I said I knew. Nettie hadn't told that story to everyone. She'd told it to me on a Sunday morning when Renata was at a soccer tournament, and it was just the 2 of us and the drawer full of pieces in the light. I said, that's the part that can't be fixed. The garnet's gone, but the others don't have to be. The process of recovering the 3 pieces from Douglas took 6 weeks. It required documentation from the estate lawyer establishing that the items had been inventoried as estate assets, a formal statement from Renata acknowledging that she had not had estate authority to sell them, and a negotiated agreement with Douglas that accounted for the fact that he had made a good faith purchase and was owed consideration for his cooperation. Renata paid Douglas back out of her own account. Not all of it at once, but an arrangement was made. My parents helped with a portion of it, not because they were required to, but because they understood, finally and without qualification, that this was a debt their family owed, and that making it right was what Nettie would have wanted. The morning the pieces came back, my mother drove to Meridian Estate Jewelers with me. Douglas brought them out in a small velvet tray, and my mother made a sound that I'm not going to try to describe accurately because I don't have the right words for it. She picked up the locket and held it the way you hold something you thought was gone, carefully and slightly disbelievingly, as if it might not be solid. We took them home. I sat with them at my mother's kitchen table and looked at each one for a long time. The bent prong on the emerald ring was still bent. Of course it was. I hadn't expected it to change, but there's something about seeing an imperfection you recognized, unchanged, that feels like proof of continuity. Like the thing came back as itself and not as a copy. I put the pearl strand in a small cedar box my father had found at a woodworking shop. He'd made a special trip to find something that approximated the drawer they'd come from. It was a quiet gesture, the kind my father makes instead of speeches, and it meant more to me than a speech would have. Renata and I talked for a long time that day, after the pieces came back. I want to be honest about where we landed, because this is not a story with a clean ending where everything returns to the state it was in before. The garnet bracelet is gone. That loss is permanent. The 6 months of church fair savings, the exact change, the Tuesday afternoon pride of a woman buying herself something beautiful because she didn't want to wait for someone else to decide she deserved it. Those stories are now being held by a stranger somewhere who knows nothing about them. Or they've moved further along a chain of ownership where they'll never be traced back to Nettie at all. That part of the story ends with a permanent absence, and I've had to make my peace with it, which is different from being at peace about it. What I told Renata, and what I meant, is that the thing I needed from her wasn't a full accounting or a dramatic reckoning. It was a simple thing, the same thing it always is in situations like this. I needed her to stop treating my steadiness like infrastructure. My reliability had always been available to her, my time, my organizational capacity, my willingness to be the one who kept the records and drove to the appointments and held things together when holding together was required. She had used all of it for years as if it were a public utility, rather than a finite resource, maintained by a person who had her own needs and her own grief and her own complicated love for a grandmother who had told her, on 3 Sunday mornings, the stories behind every piece of jewelry in a cedar drawer. She heard me. I believe she heard me, genuinely, in the way that people hear things when the documentation is sitting on the table in front of them, and there is no softer version available. She said, "I've been the one who needed, and you've always been the one who had. I never thought about what that cost you." It wasn't a perfect apology. Perfect apologies are rare because perfect apologies require a full accounting of all the damage, and no one can ever fully assess their own damage from the inside. But it was an honest one. And honest is the bar I have learned to hold things to, because beautiful and imperfect things have the best stories. Here is what I have in my possession now. The pearl strand, in the cedar box my father found. I don't wear it because Nettie's mother wore it, and I think of it as belonging to a particular lineage of women who survived particular things, and I am still figuring out if I am the right person to continue that line, or if the right thing is to let it rest. The locket with the photograph of 2 young people in front of a borrowed car. I do wear this one. I wear it on my grandfather's birthday the way Nettie wore it, because some traditions are worth carrying forward exactly as they were handed to you. The emerald ring with the bent prong. I wear this one too, on my right hand. I've thought about having the prong fixed, the way Nettie thought about it for 30 years, and I've decided not to. Some imperfect things are the ones with the best stories, and I want to keep being the kind of person who understands the difference between something that needs to be repaired and something that needs to be left exactly as it is. I've started my own inventory document, not for the jewelry specifically, but for everything that matters to me and the stories behind it. Photographs, descriptions, the reasons things are worth keeping. I've told 2 friends about it, where to find it, what's in it, what I'd want done with it. I did this not because I am anticipating anything, but because I am the kind of person who understands that the best protection for the things you love is documentation and people who know the stories. Grandma Nettie knew that. She trusted me to write it all down. She initialed every page. And she was right. If you're the one who keeps the records in your family, the one who knows the stories, drives to the appointments, shows up in the thunderstorms, and files things under love without asking for receipts, I want you to hear this directly. Your steadiness is not infrastructure. It is not a background service that runs automatically and requires no maintenance. It is a choice you make, repeatedly, out of love and responsibility and the specific kind of character that forms when you spend your life paying attention. That character has value. The documentation it produces has value. The memories it holds have value. Keep the receipts, not out of suspicion, not because you're preparing for a fight. Keep them because the things that matter deserve a record, and the person keeping the record deserves to be acknowledged for the keeping. Nettie knew that. She spent 3 Sundays making sure I knew it too. I don't know if she knew those Sunday mornings would matter the way they did, but I think she might have suspected. I think that's why she kept initialing the pages, each one, bottom right corner, the looping end she'd been writing her whole life. She was the kind of woman who knew that beautiful things needed witnesses. And she made sure I was one.